It's a new day on SpaceX Daily, episode 32, coming to you from Vancouver. It's July 14th, 2026. Let's get into today's SpaceX developments. B1080's 28th flight targets the 600th Falcon booster reuse, further compressing the marginal cost of each kilogram to orbit. Remember, we covered the Falcon reuse cadence on yesterday's episode. Today's flight pushes that further because B1080 is scheduled for its 28th mission on Starlink 10 to 45 from Cape Canaveral. The flight would mark the 600th time a Falcon 9 first stage has flown again. The booster has already completed 27 prior flights without structural retirement. This cadence directly tests the current limits of booster life and turnaround processes. The 600th reuse milestone continues the Falcon program's long-running effort to drive launch costs down through repeated recovery and refurbishment cycles. The Starlink 10 to 45 mission lifted off from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station at 5:10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. The Falcon 9 carried 29 Starlink satellites to low Earth orbit. The first stage performed a boost back burn, followed by a landing on the drone ship. This launch added to the ongoing expansion of the broadband constellation. The recovered booster was the same vehicle now approaching its 28th flight, linking the morning's successful recovery directly to the reuse milestone. A Falcon 9 lifted off from Vandenberg Space Force Base, carrying 27 Starlink satellites. The mission used a flight-proven first stage that completed its recovery sequence downrange. The launch occurred on the evening of July 13 local time. It contributed additional capacity to the constellation serving Pacific region users. The Vandenberg flight ran on a separate booster from B1080, illustrating the parallel reuse streams that now sustain daily Starlink cadence. The founding flight surgeon for SpaceX is set to board Soyuz MS-29 for his first spaceflight. The mission will carry him to the International Space Station as part of a crew rotation. This marks a personal milestone for a physician who has supported multiple SpaceX crewed flights from the ground. The flight occurs alongside ongoing preparations for future Dragon missions. His transition from ground support to orbital crew underscores the operational continuity between SpaceX's medical oversight and the broader human spaceflight manifest. NASA selected a Falcon Heavy to launch the Sunrise mission after an earlier vehicle change. The mission will study solar radio emissions using a constellation of small satellites. The switch aligns the mission with SpaceX's current heavy lift manifest. Integration and launch planning are now proceeding under the new contract. The choice of Falcon Heavy places the science payload on the same heavy lift architecture already supporting national security and commercial manifests. Remember, we covered the Starlink expansion on yesterday's episode. Today's milestone moves that forward because the constellation reached more than 10,000 satellites in orbit by mid-2026. This figure represents roughly two-thirds of all active satellites currently in space. The growth stems from repeated Falcon 9 and Starship deployment flights. The scale now supports expanded direct-to-cell and maritime services. The 10,000 satellite threshold marks a new phase in which constellation density itself becomes the primary driver of service performance and coverage continuity. Remember, we covered the Starship flight test campaign on yesterday's episode. Today's development moves that forward because the FAA closed its review of the Starship Flight 12 mishap and cleared the next test flight. The approval allows Starship Flight 13 to proceed with planned hardware changes. The agency confirmed that corrective actions meet regulatory requirements. Launch is now targeted for July 16 from Starbase. The clearance resolves the immediate regulatory hold and returns the program to its iterative flight test cadence. Starlink V3 satellites incorporate hardware upgrades for direct-to-device connectivity. The new satellites support higher laser link throughput between units. This architecture expands coverage options for handheld and IoT terminals. Deployment testing begins on the upcoming Starship mission. The V3 design therefore bridges the existing broadband constellation with the emerging direct-to-cell service layer. Lab Padre observers at Starbase noted increased activity around the launch mount and tank farm ahead of the next integrated test. Local reports indicate additional propellant loading tests occurred over the weekend. Community members tracking the site reported visible movement of ground support equipment near the orbital launch mount. These observations remain unverified by SpaceX but align with the expected pre-flight flow for Flight 13. Reddit users in r/SpaceX discussed the FAA's closure of the Flight 12 mishap investigation and what it implies for future return-to-flight timelines. Commenters highlighted the speed of the review compared with earlier incidents. Several threads focused on expected changes to the ship's heat shield and flap actuators. NASA Spaceflight published a weekly launch preview noting 7 global missions scheduled, including the Soyuz MS-29 crew flight and Starship Flight 13. The article detailed worldwide range and tracking assets that will support the Starship test. Readers commented on the overlap between the two missions and potential scheduling pressure on shared tracking resources. Worth keeping an eye on the concern that reliance on a single crew vehicle creates a single point of failure for U.S. access to the ISS after 2030. The comments appear in coverage of long-term crew transportation planning. Any extended grounding of that vehicle would leave no domestic alternative for crew rotations. The absence of a second certified U.S. crew system therefore remains the central risk highlighted by the officials. On the AI front, SpaceX and Cursor released the first jointly developed AI product, an all-round office agent now in closed beta. The agent handles document workflows and integrates with existing enterprise tools. Early testers describe it as a direct competitor to current ChatGPT workplace offerings. The release marks the initial public output of the SpaceX Cursor collaboration and places Grok-derived capabilities inside enterprise document environments. Pollution from an unpermitted XAI power project is reported to affect nearby communities disproportionately. The project supplies additional electricity for Colossus-scale training clusters. Local regulators are reviewing compliance filings tied to the expansion. The episode illustrates the power and siting constraints that accompany rapid growth of the training infrastructure feeding both XAI models and downstream SpaceX-adjacent compute needs. From an engineering standpoint, Falcon 9 first-stage reuse centers on a tightly coupled set of thermal, structural, and propulsion trades that keep the booster within its certified envelope after each flight. The octagonal landing legs, grid fins, and Merlin 1 DVAC engines must survive repeated entry heating and landing loads while the stage's propellant tanks remain leak-tight. Each reuse cycle therefore reduces the marginal cost of the booster to the price of inspection, refurbishment, and the small amount of additional propellant needed for the recovery burns. The 600th reuse milestone on B1080 shows that the cumulative effect of these small per-flight costs has already driven the effective price per kilogram to orbit well below the expendable baseline. Continued extension of booster life now hinges on whether the same hardware can absorb another 10 to 20 flights before fatigue or thermal degradation forces retirement. The engineering limit is not thrust or propellant load, but the cumulative damage to the interstage, raceway covers, and tank domes from repeated entry heating and saltwater exposure. SpaceX's approach has been to accept modest mass penalties for thicker skirts and improved coatings rather than redesign the entire structure. That choice trades a few kilograms of payload for dozens of additional flights, collapsing the idiot index, the ratio of finished stage cost to raw material and energy inputs, by roughly an order of magnitude compared with an expendable vehicle. The next observable data point will be whether B1080 or its successors can reach 30 to 35 flights before any structural inspection reveals a hard limit. Starlink V3 satellites now entering test on Starship Flight 13 introduce higher power laser terminals and direct-to-device radios on the same bus. These additions increase both inter-satellite data rate and ground terminal flexibility without requiring a full redesign of the satellite structure. The incremental mass and power budget allocated to the new payloads is offset by the larger fairing volume and higher energy margins available on Starship, illustrating how the heavy lift vehicle relaxes constraints that previously limited Constellation upgrades. The immediate engineering question is whether the V3 thermal control and power distribution systems maintain margin through the longer coast and deployment sequence planned for the upcoming test flight. And a quick market note, SPCX is at $139.14, up 0.9%. Before we go, Starship Flight 13 remains the clearest near-term test of whether the current hardware iteration closes the gap to rapid reuse. That's the day at SpaceX. That's a wrap. SPCX is trading at $139.14, up 0.9%. If you're new here, subscribe and this briefing finds you every day. I'm Patrick in Vancouver. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you tomorrow. And before you go, this show is part of the NARA Network, a family of daily podcasts on tech, science, and markets, each one a short, sharp briefing you can finish on the commute. If today earned its place in your feed, here's your next listen. Environmental Intelligence, the Environment and Climate Policy Brief for Canada. Find every show free at naranetwork.com. The age of AI puts real builders on the phone with an AI host. Apply at naranetwork.com/age-of-AI apply. This episode used AI voice synthesis of my voice. Editorial selection and analysis are my own.